Hi grade 7s, as you can see I'm back with another literature lesson, so I hope you're ready. In front of me I've got chapter notes for Whitney's Kiss. So what you're going to need is your very own copy of this, okay, and a highlighter or a pencil and a ruler, because we're going to be going through the chapters and highlighting or underlining the important parts that we need to remember. This will also help us when we're studying to create notes and to remember the really extremely important events that happened. Right, so let's get ready. Okay, we're looking at chapter 1. Now I'm not going to go through every single thing in these notes. You're going to have to read through them on their own. I'm only going to go through the things that we're highlighting. Okay, so let's get ready. Chapter 1, under point 1, we're going to highlight Western Cape and Township of Thembalethu because those are our points for our setting. Okay, then we're going to go through point 2, 3, and 4 with characters. So we highlight Whitney in point 2, Lucky in point 3, and Mrs. Pillay in point 4. Okay, those are our main characters in the novel. We encounter them the most as we're reading, and we look at their relationships in particular. Right, so we move on to point 5, point 5, and we're going to highlight primary school did not have the proper facilities. And then in point 6, you'll highlight storeroom, and in point 7, first kiss. Right. So, as we know, chapter 1 is setting the scene for us. We meet our characters, we find out where this is happening, and we also find out why Whitney was where she was. She was at the high school because the primary school did not have the proper facilities, and she met Lucky at the storeroom that day and experienced her first kiss, and we all know Mrs. Pillay interrupted that. On to chapter 2. Now, chapter 2, we're going on to point 2, okay? Point 2, you're going to highlight father, and then further on in the point, they were closer before. Father and they were closer before. Right. Now, we know that in this chapter, we learn a little bit about Whitney's home life, okay, and the consequences of her experiencing her first kiss with Lucky. Right, and then we go on to chapter 3. Point 1, highlight. Whitney was always open to Mrs. Pillay's advice. Okay, so we see that Whitney and Mrs. Pillay have quite a good relationship, a very good student-teacher relationship, but also Mrs. Pillay is a confidant, okay? Whitney approaches her and she talks about the important things that are going on in her life with her teacher. Okay, let's move on to chapter 4. Right, chapter 4, point 1, we're going to highlight the Vodacom container. The Vodacom container. And then in point 2, at the very end of the point, we'll highlight father and hospitalized. Right, so at this point, Lucky and Whitney met at the Vodacom container, and while she is there, Whitney phones her mother and finds out the news of her father being hospitalized. Right, point number 3, we're going to highlight HIV positive and progressed to AIDS. It's in line 2 under point 3. Okay, and we know that this shocks Whitney. Right, she finds out how he became infected with HIV, how her father became infected with HIV. And there's a question there that says, how did Mr. Sotelo become infected with HIV? And it is very simple. He helped an injured man, but did not wear gloves. Okay, so it goes into more detail in the novel. It says the man was bleeding. Mr. Sotelo did not wear gloves, and he had a small cut on his hand, which he did not notice until he was washing his hands after he had helped the man. It was later found out that the man that Mr. Sotelo had helped was HIV positive, and that is how Mr. Sotelo was infected. Right, on to point number 4, we can highlight devastated. kept this a secret from her. Tell people that her father had cancer instead, and people would gossip. I'm going to go over that point again. Devastated, kept this a secret from her. Tell people that her father had cancer instead, people would gossip. So here we see Whitney's reaction. She's obviously devastated, but she's also she's feeling upset because they'd kept it a secret from her. They hadn't told her until now. It had been many months. And then the mother goes on to ask her to keep it a secret and tell people that her father has cancer, because if they knew the truth, they would gossip about them. Because the people didn't really know all of the ways you could be infected, they only thought that you could be infected by being unfaithful to your partner. Okay, so she didn't want Whitney to feel excluded from groups or stereotyped because of her father's HIV and AIDS. They wanted Whitney to be able to live a normal life. So they wanted her to keep the secret. Okay. And tell people it was cancer. On to chapter 5.1. Highlight: employment was terminated. This means he no longer had a job. And that meant that they were no longer getting money from his company. Right? Point 2. Confide: Lucky and Mrs. Pillay. Confide: Lucky and Mrs. Pillay. Now we know Whitney decides to tell these two people her secret and get their take on it. And Whitney expects these people to keep what she tells them to themselves. Mrs. Pillay tells Whitney she should come out, tell the truth, and educate people, while Lucky swears on his grandmother's grave that he won't tell anyone. Right, chapter 6.2. Importance of values. Making good decisions. Stick to them. Importance of values. Making good decisions. And stick to them. So you're going to highlight those 3 things. And we know that at this point, Whitney is visiting Mrs. Pillay's house, and they're discussing one of the most important things that happens in this novel, the discussion of the value of having values. Why it is important to know before you put yourself in an intimate situation exactly what it is that you are looking for, okay? And exactly what it is you are going to be doing in that situation. Right, on to chapter 7.2. Highlight: headmaster calls her to his office. Headmaster calls her to his office. And in this point, there is a question: what news does he deliver to Whitney? And of course, he tells Whitney that her father had passed away. So at this point, Whitney learns of her father's death, and off she goes home, and she remains at home until after the funeral. Okay, chapter 8.1. Right. Highlighting: someone has told everyone that her father died of HIV and AIDS. Accused her of having HIV and AIDS herself. Okay, I'll go over that again. Chapter 8.1. Someone has told everyone that her father died of HIV and AIDS. Accused her of having HIV and AIDS herself. So we see Whitney approaches her friends and she says, you know, things are different. You are withdrawing from me. What is going on? And she finds out her secret has been let out and that they believe she has HIV herself. Okay? So in point 2, we're highlighting who told her secret and Mrs. Pillay. So at this point, we know Whitney is wondering who told her secret, and she decides it must have been Mrs. Pillay. On to chapter 9. So she decides to go to Lucky's house. Now we're looking at point 3. We're highlighting Zola had predicted Lindiwe's reaction and Lucky had told her. Okay? So in point 3, Zola had predicted Lindiwe's reaction and Lucky had told her. And then in point 4, HIV, and further along, positive. Right. So at this point, Whitney has put herself into a difficult situation with Lucky. And they are discussing how Whitney's feeling. And Lucky lets it slip that Zola had predicted how Lindiwe would react to the news. And Whitney is thinking, how is it that Zola predicted it? The only way that is possible is if Lucky had told Zola. And then it clicks for her that Lucky had told her secret and she was wrong about Mrs. Pillay. Then further on, they have a little bit of an altercation, and Whitney finds a note that confirms that Lucky is HIV positive. So Whitney is upset and off she runs to Mrs. Pillay's house. On to chapter 10, highlight. In point 1, under chapter 10, ran to Mrs. Pillay's house. Right? Then we go on to chapter 11 and we highlight. Right? You ready? English oral, teacher, father's HIV and AIDS, the lie, her HIV status, negative, Lucky, making good decisions, and the value of having values. Right, so that's 8 things, separate things you have to highlight. I'm going to go over it again. English oral, teacher, father's HIV and AIDS, the lie, her HIV status, negative, Lucky, making good decisions, and the value of having values. Right, her English oral, it was based on all of those things, right? She receives an A, everyone is clapping, and she's educated them a little bit more about how HIV and AIDS is actually spread. And then we go on to chapter 12, okay, and we're highlighting Lucky, headmaster's office, and breaks down in point 1. And then in point 2, Lucky's teacher reassured him. Right, so in chapter 12, we see Lucky is finally seeing some consequences of his actions, but he's also, he has realized himself that he's made a mistake, and he's being reassured that he can live a long and healthy life if he chooses to be healthy and make the right choices. And then at the end of the novel, we see that Whitney and Lindiwe are friends again, and that's the end of the novel. So, grade 7s, what I need you to do is I need you to go through these chapter notes on your own, read them, make sure you've highlighted and written down the answers, because these chapter notes, they tell us all the important things that happen in each novel. They are our study tool. Okay, so that's all from me. I look forward to seeing you in our next video lesson. Bye.